Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for joining us for this presentation. Jane and I will be giving the presentation jointly, alternating back and forth. The point of this talk is to contribute our preference for optimizing over compromising. You may think, well, come on, those are about the same thing. It's like glass half empty or glass half full. Well, maybe we could see them as kind of two sides of a coin, but we think the distinction is very important to us being maximally useful, beneficial to society in our role as conservators. We're going to organize this talk by discussing a challenge in terms of various biases that tend to arise when we use automated heuristic thinking. All human minds tend to default to using heuristics, that is, simple rules of thumb for thinking. Our judgments based on heuristics can be excellent in some situations, but biased and rationally suboptimal in other situations. Examples we wish to discuss in this presentation include the effect heuristic, short-term focus, numerator bias, zero risk bias, and my side bias. You'll notice that in many of our slides, we'll show covers of books that we believe are just really good, semi-popular, readable books that you might enjoy.
So looking at the first of those biases, we're going to look at the effect heuristic. And in order to examine that, I'm going to talk about the plight of refugees, an example that Paul Slovic himself has used. So when we look at the way that the world has responded to the refugee crisis, despite decades of statistics and images of displaced families and stories and narratives, there's been a very steady engagement of the public with the topic. And you can see this in terms of the Google search frequency, which you can see on the graph at the moment. And then one day, September the 2nd, 2015, that changed. Not because the plight changed, but because the image changed. That was the day we woke up to the horrifying image of Alan Kurdi washed up on a beach in Turkey. And for us, this graph is a real representation of how a visual and emotional event really transformed perceptions. We can see the impact it had on the public in this kind of measurable way by the amount of times that they Googled the word refugee. And this really helps to illustrate that our sense of importance of something is often dependent on emotional impact associated with it. And that's what's known as the effect heuristic. So apply this to the conference theme. The picture shows an article clipped from a newspaper without permission and the librarian sadly examining the home. The image was used by the library to communicate to the public why the archive room had been closed to visitors. They knew that this visual rendition of the damage or this loss was upsetting, and that's why it's used in a newspaper story for public communication. It's a much more powerful communication tool than perhaps describing the damage in terms of the number of the items affected, particularly if it was from a large collection, where it could be a very, very small percentage. Because what we know is that even in libraries, on many occasions, the heart rules the head and what is powerful in our decisions, even for matters of book preservation.
Our next bias to consider is a short-term bias. Let's imagine that I give you a choice. Under condition A, I'd say, I'll give you 1 apple today or 2 apples tomorrow. Well, I would be willing to bet that at least a few of you might be hungry enough that you choose your 1 apple today. But under condition B, imagine the choice is that you could have 1 apple a year from today, or you could have 2 apples in 1 year plus 1 day. And I would bet that everybody would be willing to wait that extra day to get 2 apples. It's that we value 1 apple in the next day much more than we would value that extra apple in a day a year from now. And there's very similar thing comes into play when we look at how long we should be preserving things for. Conservation has often been thought to have an aspirational goal to strive to preserve collections for all time. In formal risk management, we need to be more specific and consider the present value of ongoing preservation diminishes over time. The value we place on existence of a collection through next year, 2023, must be greater than the value we place on that same collection being available through a year 100 years from now. And this is known as social discounting and be seen in this graph, where the purple curve represents a discount rate of 1% per year. Rational thinking requires substituting an operational goal for our aspirational goal. In risk analysis, we model an appropriate operational goal by considering 100 years of the collection being of equal current value to us, then giving no further concern beyond 100 years. That helps us avoid a short-term focus without falling into the trap of greatly valuing the existence of the collection thousands or even millions of years from now.
So our next bias is numerator bias. And in this experiment, the participants were asked to pick a selection of jelly beans from two piles. And they were told that if they could get a prize if they found the red one. Given the piles of jelly beans, people more like to pick from pile B, even though if you actually count them up, they had a smaller probability of winning. Now, this is because of the frequency that we see the red beans on the right-hand group in group B than we see them on the left, because we do struggle to separate frequency from proportion in terms of our understanding. And it suggests that we respond to things that we see more commonly, despite the size of the population that they come from. So this applies to us. If a conservator spends their time being called in whenever there's a broken object, if a library book gets damaged, then they are going to see the damage and the loss with a much higher frequency than perhaps their librarian colleague who's working with the collection for a range of different activities and only rarely sees a broken one. Both of them see books from the same collection, but they experience them very differently because the numerator bias will prompt them to feel very differently about the probability of loss, and then might push them into different directions in terms of the decision-making around allowing people to engage with collections which may occur in loss or damage.
Another bias that can affect our thinking about these issues and the way we work with other people in resolving them is a zero risk bias. So let's say that we're done with these jelly beans now and we'll sell you them. Only €3 for this nice set of 100 jelly beans. Are you tempted to buy them? What if we offer you a money-back guarantee if you're not satisfied? Doing that, we make this a zero-risk choice. We all like certainty, hence we all favor zero risk. And this is not surprising then that in advertising, a money-back guarantee really does sway more people to make their purchase. When we put a book on exhibit, it's easy to imagine many of the various risks that book may face. It may be stolen. It may be subject to a pest attack. It may be more subject to water damage if it's more exposed. It's easy to imagine a number of different risks. But when we compare that to the collection in storage, well, perhaps it is less at risk from some of these when it's less exposed, but it's also harder for us to visualize the risks of damage or loss to the collection in storage. And we might ask ourselves, do we know what the risk of loss of items or loss of value to some of these items would be? Is it easy to think of? Might you default to thinking it's near zero risk, at least in your intuitive thinking, in a sense, out of sight, out of mind? On reflection, is it reasonable that we should think that the risks to one single item on exhibit is higher than the combined risk to the collection in storage?
Another bias we're calling my side bias. And it is comforting for us and sometimes annoying or hilarious to observe it in others, where people view the world from their own perspective. We've seen so much of this in political life with the polarized and often angry debates around the safety or otherwise of vaccinations. The so-called culture wars epitomize the mono-perspectives that people can not only not tolerate other people's perspectives, but actually filter out or disregard information that challenges their current view. Now, the power of my side bias corresponds with the strength of your beliefs. So the firmer that the belief is held, the more stronger your resistance will be to alternative perspectives. Interestingly, it's not a measure of your intelligence. So actually, when we reflect on our own practice and worry about our biases, it's not about seeking out areas where we have the least experience and expertise. It's about seeking out the areas where we have the most conviction. And that's the areas where we have to be on our guard. So where there is the care of the object at stake and there is a danger of a perceived threat, then the conflict and our conception of our response as being correct in that situation, that other people are being wrong, is almost baked in by this particular bias. So if you're worried then as a conservator that you see all the damaged objects and that you have a strong emotional response to them, and the risk from the temporary exhibition is all on your watch, whereas the consequence of decades of storage spreads over several generations and the whole team, then what you'll have is all the biases we've just described heaping up and pressing down onto you to worry that an exhibition is a very dangerous occasion. So if anyone proposes this to you, you could go straight into an adversarial mode. How little can I concede? How can I negotiate down all these alarming risks? This is the compromise that as a default response, we're tempting to discourage. But if you recognize that this might not be as bad as it feels, then what intellectual exercise can you use to help you rethink and still offer wise counsel? Now, we would argue that you should stand back, literally and intellectually, and ask yourself, am I seeing the whole picture? And what picture do other people see? And this is what we call broad framing. If you take a broader frame than the individual book at risk on a display and think about all of the risks across all of the collections over a significant time period, then you should be able to move away from two different sides negotiating compromise and into a space where if you look at the horizon, you can both be walking towards the same goal. We titled our talk Beyond Compromise is Optimize because we believe that all too often the goals of conservation are presented as a negotiation or a compromise with other activities of our organization. And we believe that this is an unhelpful formulation arising from understandable biases. We offer the suggestion that if we reframe onto higher level goals like the social benefits of an activity, we can optimize our conservation strategies rather than enter the more confrontational approach of compromise that always suggests winners and losers.
For myself, one of the most powerful tools to help us reframe thinking is to adopt a systems perspective of our issues. And we are all familiar with systems because we're made up of lots of systems. Here we have a skeletal system, a nervous system, a circulatory system, a pulmonary and a digestive system. Now, narrow framing might be really focusing in on one of these systems within us, which could be considered just a subsystem of each of us ourselves. Now, if we want to move to broad framing, then we want to look at all of these systems combined and how they work together to produce a fine result, like this fine-looking gentleman here. And one of the best resources, I think, for helping us is this fairly short and accessible book written by Donella Meadows, Thinking in Systems. And it really underlines for us how to optimize a system at a high level, whether that's our health for us as a person or the utility of our collections to present and future generations. It really requires us not to be too focused on a single subsystem, but to look at how we sub-optimize each of the subsystems in order to optimize the highest level system, the highest level goal. In the case of our collections, the goal of serving society. In conclusion, we believe it's important to recognize both emotional and clinical aspects of our decisions. It's important to think about all audiences, current and future, and all of their senses of value in the collection. To think about all items in your collection and not just an immediate one that is in question. To think about 100 years, not just the span of a single temporary exhibit, but how the collection as a whole is used throughout 100 years. And to accept that optimization requires a focus on higher level goals. Finally, optimizing can be difficult, but would you rather end up feeling compromised or optimized? Now we thank you for your attention and hope we may have a minute or two for questions.
Oh, Disagreements.
Or disagreements. Arguments would be great. Okay,